Welcome to Nesta Talks To, a series of conversations that we host here at Nesta with today's most interesting thinkers on big topics related to mission-driven innovation. My name is James Plunkett. I'm Chief Practices Officer here at Nesta. And for those who don't know, Nesta is the UK's innovation agency for social good, which means we design, test and scale solutions to society's biggest problems. And these days for us, that means working on three problems in particular: helping people live healthy lives by halving obesity, creating a sustainable future by cutting household carbon emissions, and giving every child a fair start in life by closing the school readiness gap. And in Nesta Talks To, we touch on all those topics, and we also talk a lot about the methods you can bring to bear on big complex missions such as those. We try to make these always open conversations, so as we go through, do join in by popping your questions in the chat on the right-hand side of your screens. And we will have time for questions to answer those questions at the end of the discussion. We do offer closed captions as well, which you can access via the LinkedIn live stream if you would like to do so. Today's talk is with Dan Honig, and Dan is an associate professor at Georgetown University and at UCL in London. I wanted to talk to him in particular because of his new book, Mission Driven Bureaucrats, which I highly recommend. It's a fascinating read, and it explores how managing and leading through empowerment rather than leading for compliance can deliver better outcomes in government. This obviously is very timely in the UK in particular, in the context of a new Labour government that has built its agenda around missions. And what I loved about the book was it gets quite crunchy about this question of managing for empowerment, managing for purpose. How do you do it? When does it work? When does it not work so well? What is the evidence that indeed it does work? And as one of the reviewers described the book, it's also a love letter to bureaucrats, which is a rare thing in this world. And I loved the profiles of wonderful bureaucrats throughout the book. And indeed, it tries to sort of upend what we think of when we say that word bureaucrat, which is a lovely aspect to the book. So Dan, welcome, and really looking forward to getting into conversation with you today. First question really is around this concept of managing for empowerment, because I think some people will hear that and think it means essentially just giving folk a lot more freedom, autonomy. I liked the way you were sort of rather more precise than that in the book, and you have this fuller set of kind of what do you mean specifically by managing for empowerment? What are the elements? So maybe you can start by unpacking that for us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for the warm introduction. Really a pleasure to be here. So as you say, my sort of perspective starts with what I think is the ground truth of working in agencies and with governments around the world, and seeing that there are so many public servants. There's so many bureaucrats who in fact want to do good things, but find that the rules get in the way. And as you say, we often talk about empowerment as if the only thing it can mean is removing those rules and allowing people autonomy. And allowing autonomy is one element of managing for empowerment. The other kind of two principles I illustrate are cultivating competence and creating connection to peers and purpose, right? And what these are doing is they're mapping onto this idea in psychology called self-determination theory, right? And the idea that we need sort of the freedom to feel agentic, that's the autonomy, but we also need support. We need a structure that helps us do that, that helps us feel like we are in fact effective in reaching the ends we seek, and we're having impact. We're part of teams, we're influencing those teams, we're influenced by them, and particularly in the public sector, we're having influence on the world. And so, the book tries to give sort of dozens and dozens of examples of what this ends up meaning in practice. It can be as simple as orienting people towards the mission of the agency, helping them to understand how their work contributes, right? It can also be managerial structures that really seek to support rather than control. It seems like the logic of a lot of management practice in the UK and far beyond is that we need to force bureaucrats to do things they would not otherwise do. And that may minimize the bad behavior of the bureaucrat who wants to do the worst thing. But it does so at the expense of demotivating and adding lots of frictions for the many folks who want to do good things. And maybe we'll all be better off if we let them.
And the word mission, obviously you're not using by accident in the title. So talk to us a bit about what do you mean by mission? I guess in UK context at the moment, there's a range of views on what Labour essentially may mean by missions, from quite specific meanings, as in these are the priorities of the government, and it won't cover all of what the government's doing, through to this concept more of missions, I suppose, as a kind of spirit of government or a way of going about your work day to day. So what do you mean when you're using the word mission in these contexts?
Yeah, so Ed, I think you're absolutely right to highlight that there are multiple meanings sort of competing for bandwidth at the moment, I would say, particularly in this country. So I mean missions in the way organizational behavior scholars, which is that a mission is kind of the animating purpose of a group of people trying to do something, right? So that could be a single team, right? So that could be, we are a school in this local area, and our mission is to educate children, right? So I've started talking about that as a kind of everyday mission. I mean, it's a mission within the existing structure of the agency and of the organization of government. Labor's missions are what I call grand missions. So they're sort of aspirational, often very much cross-sectoral, cross-agency goals. I think these things are quite compatible in the sense that if you are going to achieve a grand mission, what you were saying is ultimately we're going to get the humans who work in the system to behave differently, to be oriented towards this grand mission. And so some everyday missions fit nicely inside the grand missions. Sometimes we're trying to kind of reform what people see as their mission. But every group of people working collectively at something has an organizational behavior, a mission point, as I talk about it in the book, right? And that is not necessarily the kind of mission statement of the team or agency. It's the thing that actually animates the work, the thing they all understand them to be doing collectively. And those things can be contested, and those things can change. And just because you have a mission also doesn't mean it is good, right? You can be mission oriented towards a mission that other people object to, right? But I think that if we are going to accomplish the kind of grand missions that Labor has set itself, we are going to have to think at a kind of much more sort of micro level about the individuals whose actions and behaviors need to change and what it's going to take to change them. And there too, I think sort of compliance and control from the top is attractive, because it seems like you can just send signals to the system and make everyone do what you want. But I think the experience of many governments and the evidence in the book and beyond suggests that's unlikely to work, unfortunately, in achieving.
What's your sense? Because on the face of it, sometimes finding conversations around managing for purpose, empowerment, missions, and so on, it seems uncontroversial. And when you get into it, it's a big deal. There's a big distance to travel from where we are now in terms of how public agencies, institutions are managed, to this idea. And often you find actually when you push on what is the purpose of this organization, it's actually not even clear, and it hasn't even necessarily been defined. And certainly folk across the organization aren't at all clear on what the ultimate outcome is of the day job they're doing. So what's your sense of how radical is this? How far is the distance to travel from your median public institution today to where you're describing we should get to?
So I would say, my dream, I have yet to see very many institutions that are, or agencies that are where the dream is. But I think the metaphor you're using of like roads and distance and travel is fantastic, in the sense that, agencies are in different places, right? And the road from where they are to where they might want to go depends, of course, on where they want to go and where they currently are and what the terrain looks like in the middle. And all those things are very sort of specific to where you find yourself. And they're going to differ between agencies. One thing we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good, right? So it is certainly the case that many agencies are very far from what I sort of imagine is most likely to lead to the best possible outcomes for the kinds of tasks they do. By the way, that's something I haven't talked about. So in my view, the kind of optimal degree of managing for empowerment, it's not 0-1. It's not like either you're empowering or complying, but how much and what kinds of empowerment you use depend on the kind of tasks you're trying to accomplish, on how well you can monitor people, on whether kind of judgment and information that can't be codified and seen from above is necessary in it. And so, once we figure out what that destination is, almost every agency can do things. There are risky things, maybe politically risky things that can move us in the right direction for any agency, but there are also far less risky things that at least initially can help build momentum in that direction. I think at the very beginning of your question, you very nicely framed in one of them, which is, okay, what are we trying to accomplish, right? So when an agency somewhere in the world asks me to help them improve performance, improve management practice, the first thing I say is, great, what are you trying to do? And the initial answer, as you suggest, is not usually the sort of intersubjectively, organizationally wide or team wide understood answer. And so let's start often by saying, okay, what are we trying to do? What do people think we're trying to do? What would it look like to get on the same page? And then the next question is equally simple, which is, okay, what do we think is getting in the way of us doing that better? And it turns out that I have yet to find an example where if you bring together a group of people to have those conversations, they don't generate some good ideas of how to move towards more empowerment within their existing system on their own. And so, rather than worry about, the castle on the hill or where does the yellow brick road go in The Wizard of Oz? They're off to see the wizard wherever they're heading, right? So, rather than worry about that mystical future, let's think about the steps we can take on the road to move us in the right direction. And almost everyone has steps they can take that they can take within their current environment.
I mean, one thing I love about the book is it's so rich with examples then of teams you found around the world doing this fantastically well. So kind of give us a flavor of what this really looks like in practice. Give a couple of examples of where you've seen it work.
Yeah, sure. One example that comes to mind, obviously off the top of my head, but drawn from the book, is one of the profiles you talked about. So a woman named Judy Parfit, who ran human resources for the South Africa Revenue Service immediately after apartheid, right? So apartheid has just come to an end. The National Front is gone. And the Mandela administration is faced with a revenue service populated almost entirely by, I believe the word she used is loyalists, those aligned with the old regime and whatnot. And so you might think, well, this is a group of people we need to get rid of, right? This is a group of people who are unlikely to be part of the new South Africa. But Judy and the leadership of SARS more broadly doesn't take this approach. Instead, they ask employees sort of what they can do, what needs to be changed to move towards what is now clearly a new goal for the agency, a new mission, right? In, I would say, kind of a grand mission sort of sense. It's a big enough transformation, right? So we're all part of the new big rebuilding South Africa. And very few people need to be fired. The agency goes from being a very compliance-driven, hierarchical, low-performing agency to one that is, I think it is fair to say, was and remains a model institution, both within South Africa and more globally. And that means sort of treating staff, even staff who might not start out pointed in the direction you want them to, as humans, and thinking about what they want and what drives them and what could drive them, and understanding that people aren't fixed types, but rather they can change. That's obviously a kind of hard case, which is why I start with it. Most times, most agency leaders are not going to find themselves in a situation where they are worried that all of their staff are pointed, most of their staff are pointed in the wrong direction. I mean, I would say a kind of more sort of everyday case, is here in Camden. I'm speaking to you from UCL's campus in Camden, and where social services care for vulnerable children has shifted from a kind of checkbox reporting, what can we document about where the child is, to forming long-term relationships between social workers and the families of children in care through family group counseling, and really empowering the social workers to make decisions about when intervention is necessary and what kind of supports are necessary, even if there's no kind of observable trigger that some inspectorate could observe, right? By empowering the judgment of people closer to the ground, you let the information and the understandings built of those relationships come in, and you get better quality care. And I will stop there, but as you know from reading the book, I could give another 20 examples. And they all are different from each other, but they're also all the same in that they all have the feel of, guess what? It turns out if we trust and empower and seek to support employees, we often end up with better performance and less fraud, less risk of the kind we're so worried about and are trying to mitigate through these kind of top-down channels than we might have imagined. People live up to our expectations all the time. We need to let them.
And I think you say, I'm gonna mess up your quote, but there was you used the metaphor, I think, of a recipe to say there's not a sort of common way of doing this. That you replicate the same approach everywhere. The context is so different, but there are some common ingredients. So tangibly, how would you sort of list out the common ingredients of a management through empowerment approach?
That's a great question. And I mean, I would say the common ingredients of managing for empowerment are, so in a kind of broad sense, it's what I said before about allowing autonomy, cultivating competence, creating connection to peers and purpose. But in practice, that usually looks like, understanding where employees are and what they want, right? Understanding whether that differs from what you want them to do, and figuring out what is going to encourage and support them in doing the things you want them to do. And, in some ways, like an early reader of this from the academic side, right, said, Dan, I think it all makes sense, but, there's a little bit of a problem, which is it's really not complicated enough. Our new managerial theories, they need, fancy language and complexity. And what you've just said, I think everyone walking down the street would agree with. And I guess I hope that's feature, not bug, right? So the ingredients are treat people like people as much as anything. And I would say that's kind of common thread, and seek to support them.
And it's nice. I mean, I like the way in the book you are, honest about that. Not every task, not every organization, every context, every task lends itself. Indeed, it's not. There is no sort of full management through empowerment. There's always going to be a blend of some techniques from compliance, if you like to use that phrase, some techniques more empowering. I think you give the example in the book of a sort of checklist that, if there's a compliance mechanism like a checklist for is the plane ready to take off from the runway, that might be a case for having a compliance tool, because a checklist can be useful. But those compliance tools can't achieve everything for you. So maybe say a bit more about that sort of that blend, that complexity, how that comes in, what kinds of tasks lend themselves more to compliance, what kind of tasks to empowerment.
Yeah. So I like the plane taking off from the runway, which I don't use in the book, but could well have. And so, let's think about what we can observe about whether the plane's ready to take off from the runway. I say as a non-specialist in planes in any way, but it seems to me, we know something about the flaps, and we've checked the engines, and, we've pushed off and checked all of these technical things, right? And these are all things that are verifiable. That's why we have a checklist for them. We do them. And if they're done, then the plane's ready to go in that sense. And if not, then it's not. And where the kind of nature of the task has that feature that we can observe and verify whether it's happened or not, managing for compliance can be a great idea. So, I might not want to be a package delivery driver who is monitored by GPS. And, these days, UPS even has protocols on like what pocket you should put the pen in, so that you're more efficient when you open the door. And, they are really trying to micromanage and optimize. And I might not enjoy that, but I have no reason to think that's not very effective, because all of the things about delivering packages we can really observe and verify. And so it makes every sense in the world that we have a lot of compliance there. But, where it doesn't make sense is when we have to rely on judgment. And it turns out that's most of the time in the public sector, right? So, there's some great work that looks at the government of Ghana, and Ghana has kind of standardized performance reports for all of its ministries and agencies, right? They all report with a single format, and it sort of goes back and asks, how often do we know ahead of time exactly what it's going to look like to do good work, like what the right steps are going to look like, and can we also go back and say if that good work happened, right? So we can look backwards and say, okay, we have enough evidence that we can tell very clearly whether that can. And they determined that about 15% of reports have that feature, right? About 85% of reports, you can't figure those things out because most of the things we ask government to do are complicated. That's one of the reasons we're asking government to do them. They're not verifiable. And where that's true, we need at least some degree of judgment. I will say, I started out with questions when I began this research, and I ended up as an advocate. And one of the things that I thought was going to really come up over and over again when I was doing the research was, well, sometimes you have the right people and sometimes you don't, right? Because you don't just need the task to be the right kind of task, a task where we sort of need judgment and empowerment. You also need people who want to do the right thing. But it turned out it's really, really hard to find examples of people who don't want to do the right thing, right? If it's not true in the South African Revenue Service, if it's not true, I talk in the book a little bit about my own experience as chief of staff to the Minister of Finance in Liberia right after Ellen Johnson Sirleaf came to office, right? So, we ran a Ministry of Finance with 14,000 people, most of whom had been appointed by Charles Taylor and his allies, right? If we found empowerment work there, if it works in South Africa, if it works everywhere we seem to look, depending on the nature of the task, then maybe it really just does come down to the nature of the work. But as you say, it's not 0-1. And every system, when I say empowerment, what I mean is more empowerment than we have now, not some system where we have, kind of no compliance, no top-down measures.
And the flip side of that I find very persuasive in the book is, in a way, the core of the argument that it's very hard to get someone to do something they don't want to do. And so, as you say, if it's highly measurable and tick box and meets that kind of is that kind of task, that works. But the examples you give, I think, from Delhi, teachers being sort of encouraged to turn up, so to reduce teacher absenteeism, having cameras in classes to check if the teacher's there, are the teachers that you want in the classrooms the teachers that are only there because there's a camera that would otherwise tell them that they're not there. And so it was effective, I think, that intervention on getting teachers to turn up, but not so effective at making them teach well once they were there, right?
Totally. And I mean, that's sort of, so when the task can all be seen, we can make people do things by linking it to rewards and sanctions. And that's basically been the technology we've been using for 40 years. And that's solved some problems, right? But all of the problems we haven't solved, they very often tend to have the kind of feature you've talked about there. What an economist would call a multitask situation, right? We want people to do some observable things and some unobservable things. And if we use compliance to force them to do the observable things, they'll do more of them, but they'll do less of the unobservable things, right? So you just gave a great example in the book. And as you say, cameras make teachers show up. A teacher showing up is better than no teacher. That means student learning does go up in response to this kind of rollout of a compliance technology. But there's not very far to go from there, because now you have teachers in classrooms who don't want to teach. Another example of this kind of multitask problem comes from Pakistan, where a scholar named Yasser Khan runs a randomized control trial where some community health workers are given financial incentives for visiting homes of mothers who've just given birth, right? Engaging in antenatal care and measuring how kids are doing, right? And some are given no financial incentives, but they get together 3 times to talk about the mission. What brought them to the work? Why does it matter? What happens as a result, right? And as you might expect, the people who are paid to show up at houses more, right? But in this case, we can see not just what happens in process. We can see not just the showing up at houses. We can also see how healthy the kids are at the end. It turns out that paying people more money in this context helps less than not changing their salary at all and helping them kind of reconnect to the mission. It is those community health workers that lead to healthier kids. And why is that? Well, it's because there's a reason they're community health workers, which is they want to help kids, and reminding them of that and connecting them to that, connecting them to each other is more motivating for all the things you can't measure, for all the things you can't observe, than more money in your pocket at the end of the month.
Some really interesting question coming in, but I just want to sort of start to get into this. What does it mean concretely at different levels of the system? I wonder, for example, in the context of the Labour government coming in, having these grand missions as you described them. One of the kind of very live questions is what's your sort of architecture, sometimes delivery architecture, sometimes called, at the center of a government, at the center of a very complex, large, sprawling system where you're trying to move the dial on these big, complex missions, big outcomes. What does your analysis kind of mean for that highest level of government? Like, given someone's read your book, how would they then go about setting up a mission architecture at the center of government? What would they do differently as a result of taking the lessons from your book to heart?
Yeah, so I know a bit about I have some understanding of the emerging architecture. And let me say, I don't think any of it is incompatible with managing for empowerment. But I do think it has to mean something different than, at least in my informal and usually off the record conversations, it seems like it's me at the top of government. And here's what I mean. So, you can set up a mission board and you can have that have the most senior people in government or some of the most senior people in government on it. And you can bring together the people who are going to be most involved at a kind of, ministerial and sub-ministerial level from various ministries in addressing that grand mission. I think all of that's a good idea. The question is, once you've got all those people in the room, what do we think it is? So you talked about the architecture. So we've got the architecture. What do we use it for, right? So the scaffolding is there. Now, how are we actually, like, I don't know, moving people around the building or something? And it seems to me that, so like the logic of the mission architecture is very close to the logic of kind of delivery units under the last Labour government and others, right? And delivery units, we know actually quite a lot about delivery units from all around the world. And delivery units are great at exactly the things that compliance is great at, right? So they're great at focusing attention on things. They're great at where we can pull control up, right? They're great at then sending signals down where that's going to work in doing things. And they tend to work for just as long as we keep paying attention to them. That's kind of the stylized facts of the delivery units, right? If Labour was trying to, I don't know, build schools, right? If that was the mission, I would say that architecture might work reasonably well. But if instead we're trying to transform lives, if we're trying to do things that that require kind of judgment and discretion and can't be so monitored, now the question becomes, what do all of us sitting in that mission board, or in what I understand is about to be renamed the Prime Minister's Mission Unit, right? So what do those folks do day to day? Well, they can still use data. I'm hugely in favor of using the data we have. I'm hugely in favor of thinking about whether we're making progress in the ways we need to make progress. But we should be using that data in part to think about the outcomes, and in part to think about how the ways of working are changing inside government. And we sitting in that room can also ask the question, okay, well, what's getting in the way? What can we learn from the various ministries, the various agencies, the various teams? What architecture can we put in place to have them collaborate more? How can we think about how we can use our powers to unblock things, not to command things, and to unleash the talents, not just of civil servants, but also of citizens and private sector actors and third sector actors. There are a mission board and that architecture at the top can be a critical foundational support to the system. What it can't be is a kind of cloud hovering over the system, making it do what it wants to do. That is unlikely to work for these kinds of missions.
And it strikes me the argument there is sort of twofold, and on your comparison with previous Labour government. That one is those kind of more deliverology compliance type or reporting mechanisms are partial in their impact or uneven and work better for some kind of outcomes than others. I mean, I wonder if also is the argument that to some degree the world has changed, the kind of problems we're facing have become arguably more complex. The world arguably is more complex with respect to technology, with respect to the sort of interactions you get between these big complex challenges. And so that's now less suitable for today's world than it might even have been 30 years ago.
I guess I think that is sometimes true. So sometimes the world has gotten more complex and there are more actors. Sometimes it's simply a case that, we've solved the bit of the problem we could solve that way already, right? So it's not, had we in the hypothetical that we had never thought of kind of deliverology, right? We might have a whole set of problems that were still tractable to it because we hadn't addressed it, even in today's world. But we did have those thoughts. We did have that operating modality, and thus a lot of those things have already been addressed. I mean, I also think like, you know, making progress is also something that is done versus a baseline, versus where you find yourself as a society. And I think, you know, maybe this is another way of saying the same thing. I think it's more that the problems that remain are ones that, from our current baseline, need that different kind of technology. But I also do agree with you that the more actors we need to get involved in solving a problem, in general, the more we are not going to be able to manage in top-down compliance-oriented ways. And at least to my light, you know, the global challenges we face are just that. They're global and not tractable to kind of thinking in siloed delivery mechanisms. And that's become a little bit of, you know, pablum, you know, something that's said and not done to break out of our silos, but it doesn't make it wrong. Sometimes the cliche is true because, you know, the cliche is there because it expresses a truth, and I do.
And I think I buy that. I mean, I think I've used the metaphor before about you know, if you're fishing from a pond using the same fishing technique for a long time, then you'll have caught the fish that respond to that technique. And ironically, because it's been successful, you'll need to change your technique. Not to say we've solved all the big deliverology problems by any means, but we've made some progress, or at least maybe need to broaden our repertoire of different tools we use. So I want to bring in a question from Alice in the chat, which is sort of the converse of my question about the sort of top of the system. So she's asking around, you know, is it the case that only really very senior leaders in the system have the power to permit other managers to take this kind of approach? So is it, like, what do you do? You're in a big complex system that's largely compliance oriented in its outlook, methods, processes, all the rest of it. Do you have any real discretion as a manager in the middle of a system like that to adopt some of the approaches you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alice. Thank you for it. Yes, short answer, yes, right? So, and not even just the managers, also the people who are primarily being managed, right? So, you know, we've been, in part because we were talking about kind of like the top of government architecture just a minute ago. I gave an answer that sort of looked from there. But, you know, I have yet, so another thing that happens when I come in and start talking to folks inside government is often they want to focus on kind of changing the formal rules, right? So when I say what's getting in the way, okay, here's a operating rule or even a monitoring framework that's keeping us from doing things. And absolutely, the people with the power to change those rules and frameworks tend to be towards the top of the system. But, you know, managers, so you can move towards managing for empowerment by just getting your team together and talking about what it is we're trying to do, right? That's the Pakistan example in some sense. It can be as simple as, you know, peers having kind of peer mentors who work together to think about cases, right? And educate each other's judgment and work in those kinds of ways. And, you know, it can be as simple as kind of affinity groups for employees in a big organization who share interests and want to talk about different ways of working, communities of practice, those kinds of things. I have yet to meet a team that is unable to move in a positive direction because the constraints are just so large. Of course, how far you can move, you know, somebody at this level can affect less than somebody 4 levels above them in terms of the scope of the organization. But, you know, I think the evidence in the book and well beyond is that we see high performing and low performing teams. We see more and less empowered teams, even inside the same function, inside the same organization. And what explains that variance? It's the intentional actions of managers and sometimes of staff. There's a fantastic book called Patchwork Leviathan I would recommend, which is about just that. It's about kind of the high performing teams, written by a friend of mine named Erin McDonald. If you want to think more about that, Alex.
I want to come on some of the sort of critiques or tensions, I guess, in this approach in a minute. I wanted just to explore that point you make, because I recognize this in conversations about missions, that before you know it, when you're talking about missions, it jumps to sort of governance structures, processes, flowcharts, which are an important aspect of mission, of how any organization functions, right? But the conversation rarely turns to capability, culture, managerial practice, as you're spending so much, putting so much focus on, rightly. And I wonder if, I mean, in a way, those kind of governance processes are choices that are made often at the top of a system. But one of the things you're saying, it seems to me, is that actually there's more discretion in the system to work in these ways, because a lot of it is about culture, is about the way we turn up day to day. And there's almost, I mean, arguably some of what creeps in these kind of compliance systems is a sort of helplessness, or a sort of people almost underappreciate the amount of power they actually have as bureaucrats, right, in a big complex system. So is that sort of part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's well said, perhaps better said than I say it. And I think I'll give a concrete example in just a second that I think illustrates it. But first, the point you're making about sort of the formal and the informal, right? So before we were talking about like what you can observe as a manager in what your employees are doing and what you can't observe, right? It's also true that you can't observe an organization and understand it simply by looking at its kind of formal rules. I was having coffee earlier today. I suspect he won't mind this bit of it being on the record with Greg Power, who has a lovely recent book called Inside the Political Mind, and he's making just this point about legislatures and politicians, right? He was saying that, look, you think you can understand Parliament by looking at its formal structures. You can't. And thus, when we have turnover, as the point the book makes as well, when we have a lot of turnover, we lose those kinds of informal understandings that actually are required to make Parliament work. Well, what's true of Parliament is true of any organization, including government organizations. And in some ways, the kind of private sector literature on organizational behavior and private sector managerial practices have known this for quite some time. We talk a lot in the public sector about taking from the private sector, but we take the kind of formal framework. What we don't take is, in fact, that informal understanding about informal understandings, and about this notion that actually there's much more flex in the system and managers have a lot more agency than we sometimes think. And so I promised an illustrative example. And in the book, I talk about some work I do with a fast stream civil service program operating in a few countries in Africa. And I was worried, if I'm honest, when I was asked to work with this program, this wonderful organization called Emerging Public Leaders. And my worry was that you take some young, hyper-motivated, high-performing college graduate, and you put them in a team that is not really very agentic, and they are going to be demotivated, right? You've got a bunch of, sort of people who are just passing time. You put one person in, how is that one person going to change things? It felt like a kind of like a hero sort of plan that I wasn't 100% sure would work, though I hoped it did. And this is yet another case in which I was very, very happily wrong. And so, because what happens is that, the way these cultures change, so it seems that these folks not only do good work, they also help change the culture of the agencies, the teams they're in, we find, right? And how does that work? Well, so 4 of us are sitting there and this new kid comes in. And a new kid says, well, why don't we do it this way? Maybe we can have some impact. And the 4 of us say, this is really not going to do much. We've seen this tried and failed before, and so let's not waste our time. And so, new kid tries anyway, and lo and behold, good things happen. Lo and behold, their behavior turns into results, right? And then I sit there and I say, well, okay, I mean, I guess maybe it is worth exerting some effort, So we often confuse people who are demotivated for people who are unmotivated. We think somebody's a kind of type of person who can't engage in agentic behavior. But in fact, they're a type of person who could, but doesn't think it's worth it. And why try if I'm just going to fail? And, cultures change through kind of like what looks like valid practices. You want to get farmers, right? I used to run a nonprofit in East Timor focused on agricultural empowerment. Different life, I could talk about it a different time. But in that work, one of the things people who work in agriculture know is if you want farmers to adopt a practice, have other farmers adopt a practice, right? Have people see that people like them can do things differently and get positive results out of it. And focusing on that informal rather than just those formal structures of delivery and of organization are huge underexploited, untapped way forward.
So I want to come on and talk about risk in a minute, because I think this example of bringing in a kid with fresh ideas it's going to bridge us into a worry some people have about these kind of practices of like, what does that do to your risk exposure and so on. But I'm just going to first come to Linda's question in the chat, which is makes me think of actually a report we put out recently, which was called The Radical How, which looked at partly what could you learn from digital practices actually for mission-driven working. And one of the kind of key insights there is small teams, essentially. So if you build a smallish team around an outcome, then your organizational agility goes up. Those teams can learn quickly, these quick feedback loops, easier to maybe build some of these cultures in a small unit under maybe an inspiring leader that connects the team to purpose. Have you sort of learned over time from your interactions with agencies, is there an optimum team structure, team size to do this kind of work?
That's a really interesting question. And Linda, I love the question. It's one of those questions that I sort of wish I'd asked myself it and written a few pages about it in the book, because the book does not address your excellent question, at least not head on. And I think, James, I am drawing, as you suggest, more on my intuition here than on rigorous research in this case. I think the optimum team size for doing something innovative, right? If we're actually trying to design a new process or roll out something new, often has the features that wonderful Radical How report, which I highly recommend, advocate, right? So you want small, agile teams, right? And you want those agile teams so that they can have high levels of internal trust and psychological safety, so that they can adapt quickly to new information, so that they can form really in-depth common understandings and learn who has what kind of information and what each person's comparative advantages, et cetera, et cetera. So, one thing perhaps is a little awkward to say at Nesta, given you are indeed the innovation agency as you put forward, but lots of ways of encouraging people to be more mission-driven and getting mission-driven management to lead to better performance does not involve what at least traditionally is thought of as innovation. That is, it might be new for the team or the structure, but we're not actually trying to devise anything new, right? So even take the Camden family group counseling, right? So they didn't invent family group counseling, this kind of empowered social worker system I was talking about. They took it from somewhere else. So that's the adaptation of an innovation. That's not innovating themselves. And when you're trying to kind of roll out a new practice, but also if you're trying to not even do that and just get better performance from your teachers in the classrooms, then it's less clear that the optimal team size needs to be small. And so Linda, your question begs a question of its own, which is, what particular things do we want that mission delivery unit to change? If by mission delivery unit we mean, how do we bridge across these silos and innovate and build something new, or build new digital processes? I think that's why we see this happening so much with an IT component, because we are almost always in green fields. So Jen Polka has a wonderful book called Decoding America that I suspect some in the audience have read. If you're trying to build new things and processes, absolutely, you want small, agile teams. If you're trying to change how a large set of structures work, you want to bring in as much agility as possible. You want to build as much trust as possible. But I don't think you have the same kind of constraints in terms of team size.
Right. I want to spend a bit of time on the sort of critiques, I suppose, or the worries people voice, and I hear people voice when I sort of get into conversation with folk around empowerment, autonomy in organizations. I mean, number one is risk, and very often the response, certainly in a public sector context, is that sounds scary, that sounds risky. You're talking often about domains that have a lot of risk in them, children's social care settings, etc., where I think at least the instinct is that these compliance management through compliance might not get you quite to great, but at least it brings down your risk. And surely it's more risky if you're giving folk more freedom to try things out, more autonomy in their roles. So what's your response? Are people onto something with that? Is that right? How do you think about the relationship between risk and empowerment?
Yeah. So, and for what it's worth, first, let me say, I love that you're having conversations with people about autonomy and management empowerment. I highly recommend that for all viewers, all participants here. So I hear the same thing, and exactly that same word, risk, right, or its cousin, accountability. And I usually start by asking of what, right? So you just specified of what. So what the risk is of. So risk of children, meeting bad outcomes, right? So I guess that is great, and we not the bad outcomes part, but framing the risk that way. That is indeed how we should frame the risk in terms of how we think about children in care or vulnerable children in general. And I think the first thing we have to accept is that, in fact, there is no system that can prevent any bad action happening to any child. We have no known system that does that. Doesn't matter how compliance oriented it is, doesn't matter how quickly the state intervenes. And that's another question we need to ask, right? What do we think is the appropriate domain and responsibility of the state in this regard? The question, I think our compliance systems are not actually optimized to minimize that risk. I think we should figure that out, right? Like, I think we should try different ways of managing. And if we indeed find that tragically this is leading to many more bad outcomes for children, that would be a very good reason to stop doing it, because we don't always just want to maximize average performance. Sometimes we do care about kind of the bad negative outliers in particular, and I think children care is a great place where we absolutely should do so. That is the right approach. I don't think that's what our current systems do. I think what our current systems do is they minimize a particular risk, which is not the risk to children, but rather the risk to the organization. That is the risk that something happens to a child, which is attributable to the compliance behavior of the system itself. And if something bad happens to a child unrelated to those things, we say, well, that was beyond the domain of the system. And so, if you're forming a relationship with a family, if you are helping children who are vulnerable, move towards a kind of culture of trust rather than fear, right? Of one where they have resources they can draw on, where families see themselves as part of the process, et cetera, then what the evidence shows is you end up with better outcomes for children and fewer negative events, right? It is true that when those negative events happen, those negative events will happen in families you've already had contact with as the state. And if what we're trying to avoid is the chance that any bad thing happens to a child that has ever been touched by the state, well, there is a really easy solution to that. And that is, as in the book I talk about in the context of Detroit, that is to take kids out of their houses as quickly as possible. That is almost any time you encounter a vulnerable child, to remove them from the home and move them to, in Detroit, which is my hometown, an inadequate foster care system, and say, well, now nothing bad can happen to them because we didn't intervene. But that is not the same as maximizing the outcomes for the children. That is not the same as minimizing the risk for the children. And you know what? If we empower social workers, we are going to get different forms of accountability that help to reduce that risk, right? So, if I think about the recent tragedy in Haringey here in the UK, why were multiple warning signs ignored? We could treat that as a flaw in compliance, but we could also say, well, there were lots of other social workers who were also part of the milieu. As it currently stands, those social workers were not empowered, did not feel agentic to sort of raise issues, to take what they had observed and note that things maybe needed to be done differently. And if we had accountability structures that didn't all the way up, that weren't so hierarchical and so compliance driven, maybe in fact we would have avoided that tragedy. But ultimately, it's an empirical question. And if we find out that some form of management is bad for kids, we shouldn't do that. But I'm not at all convinced that the risk that we are minimizing is in fact the risk to outcome. It's rather the risk to kind of reputation or responsibilization or something.
And I think this point about accountability and systems that end up being built to essentially avoid any kind of accountability or minimize blame is pertinent. I'm reading at the moment Dan Davies' book, The Unaccountability Machine, which I recommend to others. Talks about accountability sinks, where no one is blamable in a system because the decision was made by the compliance system itself, as opposed to any human. And I think, I mean, feels persuasive, this point about culture, right? It's very hard for these kinds of horizon style, these kind of very large risks to emerge if you have a culture in which people are comfortable to blow the whistle, for example, and feel empowered to call out bad stuff they see happening. Feels like that's in a way more likely to be bred in a compliance system where folk don't feel empowered to.
100%. And accountability is one of these words that, you know, when somebody uses the word accountability, I, maybe in a pointy-headed academic way, I often say, like, can you say this sentence again without the word accountability? And the reason I do that is because, you know, people can turn them, can get into pretzels. Like, you know, I've had multiple people say effectively, like, well, this undermines accountability, but it increases performance and reduces negative outcomes. To which I say, well, what's accountability for exactly? We could have different theories of it, right? But if one of our main theories of why we want accountability is because it makes things better, if it's making things better, maybe we are not thinking as fully as we could. And, you know, accountability doesn't have to mean accounting. It doesn't have to mean just data and numbers. That's not what the word started out meaning. And I think in part because of this kind of compliance-based way of thinking about government in the last 40 years, we've come to misunderstand the full richness of what it is for people to be accountable. That social worker working with that family who feels responsible to them, that social worker is accountable to that family in a way, in an accountability relationship that's much deeper than their accountability up the hierarchy.
The other link here, which is the other sort of challenge I hear back, is links into democracy, in essence. And I think I hear this coming back from folk, again, in government departments, obviously highly relevant, where you know, this idea of pushing power down, pushing decision-making down away from, in essence, the elected minister, who is themselves accountable to Parliament for the outcomes of the department. And sometimes people voice, I think, an understandable nervousness about, is that a sort of anti-democratic move in some sense, that you're giving a team the right to make decisions that should in essence be made by an elected official, and maybe that elected official can therefore end up feeling in some sense personally less accountable because they're making fewer of the decisions, if you like. So how do you think about that sort of, is that a tension between democracy and these ways of running organizations, or do you not see it that way?
I guess I don't see it that way. And that's because I don't think democracy is only about sort of electing people and then asking them to control everything, right? So, you know, democracy, hugely in favor of free and fair elections, let me say that, hugely in favor of politicians who take responsibility and are responsible to Parliament. But that's not the only, you know, when we think about democratic accountability, democracy theorists sometimes talk about what they call the long and the short accountability, right? So it says in the book, but I talk about this in my teaching and in other places. So, and the long route of accountability is what you just described, right? So the citizen elects the parliamentarian who holds the minister accountable, who speaks to the deputy minister, who speaks to the, you know, whatever is below there, and eventually we get down to the frontline actor. The short route of accountability is the citizen is in an accountability relationship with that frontline actor, and the two of them are responsive to each other, right? And in a relationship with each other. And, you know, one thing that I know Nesta and yourself have been working on is how to make the state in some sense more relational. Well, you know, a relational state requires both of those actors, both the citizen and the state agent, to be able to act and respond to one another. And I guess I don't think that's any less democratic. Frankly, it feels to me more democratic in the sense that if a democracy is a system of government in which the government is responsive to citizens, for some things, do we declare war? Absolutely, that should be made at the top by the aggregation, right? But if the question is, you know, I don't know, you know, how do we best care for children in this community? Like, I don't know that moving it all the way up to Parliament and then having it all the way come back down is the most democratic of systems. And, you know, I think good government, you know, however we define it, a government that satisfies people, that is more what they want, that fulfills more of their expectations of government and that forms relationships of trust and understanding. If that's less democratic, I'm not sure I'm so excited about that noun. But I think it's more democratic.
And it is though, isn't it? I mean, it's a challenge to political culture in a sense, in that, you know, I've written recently about this sort of perception that politics and the role of a politician is to announce things, is to you know, announce policy. The policy is an answer, and therefore the implication the politician has an answer. When they're elected, obviously, a manifesto is a list of answers essentially to problems. And I guess, you know, for this to work well, for you to flow this, come to lead by example from the top, and to flow this sense of agency through an organization, in some senses the politician has to say, this is the mission I care about, this is the outcome I care about, this is where I believe we can get to. I don't know how we'll get there, I don't have the answers, but I'm damn confident I can create the conditions in which people can get there, and I back people to do that. That's something we find hard, I would say.
100%. And, you know, setting direction, absolutely, you know, should be done at a political level, whether that be a national politician or a local one, depending on where, you know, where power is setting. But, you know, this speaks to something, you know, for a long time. So I'm sort of an economist by training. I went to a PhD program that mostly trains economists. And, you know, in economics, there's all of this talk about what they call the implementation gap, right? And the idea there is like, we've set the policy, we've figured out the right thing to do. And then, you know, there's just this small little thing at the end called implementing that policy that's getting in the way. And, you know, the thing is, like, if our policy is let's improve people's lives, or, you know, I don't know, pro-growth, right, to take labor's first mission, right? Like, it's all about the implementation, right? In fact, in some sense, policy is being made every day by the bureaucrats who are helping to execute, right? And what that politician can do is set the conditions and provide a kind of support and accountability mechanism to that system to keep it on course. This is the right kind of thing I'd like to see. This is not the right kind of thing I'd like to see. But that's different than imagining that simply announcing the policy is going to lead to anything. I mean, you know, if every election manifesto, if every policy, if every, you know, poverty reduction strategy in the developing world had been implemented to 30% of what it is written on the paper, we would live in a world that's flourishing in a way it is not, in my view. And that is because simply writing a policy on paper is easy. And writing a paper on policy without really thinking about what your architecture of implementation looks like and who is doing the actual work is even easier. And the more you do that, the more you get a lovely, lovely glossy booklet that is going to gather dust in Whitehall, and the less you get something that actually changes lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's, you know, no coincidence that we've seen decline in trust and so on. And for me, at least, having my career's moved from sort of centre of government, number 10, cabinet office, etc., through to frontline delivery charities, and that size of that implementation gap, as you say, even seeing it as a gap is a sort of a strange framing, because, as you say, so much of the answer sits in delivery, in implementation, right? And it does seem to me that a lot of the challenge around trust sits there as well. Thanks, Dan. Really fascinating conversation. We've come to the end of our time. Thanks to everyone for the fascinating questions in the chat as well. I do recommend the book. It's, as I said at the start, it's a lovely mix of academic robustness, but then it has this real heart to it. And lovely, the profiles throughout of bureaucrats are a real pleasure to read. And it reminds us all that when we think of that word bureaucrat, we shouldn't think of the sort of the pen pusher compliance type image of the bureaucrat, but people who put their heart and soul into everything they do. Thanks everyone for listening. We always circulate a short survey, which the link should be there in the chat. There is an incentive for the survey, which is a £50 book voucher if you're entered into a prize draw if you fill out the survey, so that we can ourselves be agile and responsive and improve these sessions. So please do jump in and do that. Thank you for joining us. If you haven't signed up to our newsletter, please do that. That's how you can stay in touch with these sessions. And thank you again to Dan for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for the forum. Thanks to all of you for attending. Those interested in more, so the website for the book is missiondrivenbureaucrats.com. Whoever wins that 50-pound voucher can buy 2.5 copies of Mission Driven Bureaucrats, that fine voucher. And anyone who would like to get in touch, if I can be helpful to you or your organization, there's a there's a form on that website. Answer a few simple questions, and would be delighted to be of help if I can. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, everyone.